The words hit Eva Hale like a fist to the sternum, knocking every last breath from her body. I said what I said, and I meant it from the start. Homer Reed stood in the doorway of the ranch house, his broad frame blocking out the October sun, his jaw set in that infuriating line she had learned to read like scripture over the past 4 months. I needed a housekeeper through harvest. That was the arrangement. You knew it when you came. Eva stood at the kitchen table, her hands pressed flat against the worn pine surface. A letter from the Calder County Employment Gazette still curled between her fingers. The letter that had brought her here. The letter that had never once used the word temporary. "You told me to make this place a home," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which was its own kind of miracle. "You told me to plant the kitchen garden in rows because you liked them straight. You told me," she stopped, because her throat was doing something treacherous and she refused to let it win. "You told me things a man does not tell a woman he plans to discard with the first frost. I am not discarding you." His voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough that she caught it. "I am releasing you from an obligation that was always temporary. That is a different thing. Is it?" It was not a question, she made sure of that. Homer Reed looked away from her then. He looked at the floor, at the window, at the calendar on the wall where October was slowly running out of days, anywhere but at her face. And that was when Eva Hale understood with cold, absolute clarity that this man was not ending something. He was trying to survive something. He was terrified of her, of what she had become to him, of the fact that she had outlasted every wall he had ever built, every excuse he had ever manufactured, every carefully rehearsed reason he had stockpiled for why a woman should not stay. She let that understanding settle into her bones. Then she pulled out a chair, sat down, folded her hands, and looked at him with the steady patience of a woman who had walked 300 miles through dust and deception, and a dark past that would have broken someone with less spine. "Sit down, Homer," she said quietly, "and tell me the truth this time." The truth, as it turned out, was 4 months deep. To understand it, you had to go back to the beginning. Back to a June morning in 1882, when Eva Hale arrived in the town of Redrock, Texas, with 42 cents, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and absolutely no intention of being anyone's seasonal arrangement. She had come from Galveston, which was not as glamorous as it sounded. In Galveston, she had been a seamstress in a dress shop, owned by a woman named Mrs. Colette Marsh, who paid in intermittent cash and constant criticism, and who had finally, in early May, informed Eva that the shop was closing, and that Eva had 2 weeks to make other arrangements. 2 weeks, after 4 years of service, delivered without a flicker of remorse across Colette Marsh's powdered face. Eva had spent those 2 weeks reading every employment notice she could find. The ad in the Calder County Employment Gazette had been brief and functional. Housekeeper needed, Redrock, Texas. Room and board provided. Apply by post to H. Reed, Box 7, Redrock Post Office. She had applied. She had received a short, direct reply, written in a hand that was surprisingly neat for a rancher's. The reply confirmed room and board, confirmed the expectation of cooking, cleaning, and light household management, and stated that the position would last through the autumn harvest season. She had read that last clause 3 times. She had decided that seasons could be renegotiated. She had packed her carpetbag and boarded the stagecoach south and west, moving toward something she could not name but could feel in her chest like the first pull of a compass needle finding north. Redrock in June was blinding. The town sat in a flat basin between 2 low ridges of red rock that gave it its name, and the sun hit everything at an angle that made the dust look like it was on fire. Eva stepped off the stagecoach and stood on the main street for exactly 90 seconds, getting her bearings. She was 24 years old. She had brown hair that she wore in a practical knot, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, and she was not beautiful in the easy, decorative way that men commented on loudly. She was beautiful in the way that crept up on a person slowly, the kind of beauty that lived in the movement of her hands and the quality of her attention, and the way she held herself when everything around her was falling apart. A man was waiting near the post office with a horse and a wagon. He was watching her with the careful, assessing look of someone who had learned caution the hard way. He was taller than she had imagined, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were somewhere between green and gray, and perpetually squinted against the sun. He wore a blue cotton shirt that had been washed many times and a hat with a dent in the crown that suggested a practical personality over a vain one. He was, Eva would estimate, somewhere in his early 30s. He had the kind of face that had been handsome before something hard had happened to it and was still handsome in the aftermath, the way ruins can be beautiful. "Eva Hale," he said. "Homer Reed," she replied. They looked at each other for a moment with the mutual wariness of two people who have corresponded by letter and are now recalibrating their assumptions. "Wagon's here," he said. "I can see that," she said. He took her carpetbag without asking, which she would have objected to except that the clasp was broken and she was worried it would give way at an inopportune moment. She climbed up to the wagon seat herself, and he didn't offer his hand, and she didn't need it, and somehow that small exchange set a tone. The Reed Ranch was 4 miles outside of Redrock, at the end of a red dirt road that wound through scrub, brush, and mesquite, and the occasional spread of wildflowers that had no business being that cheerful in that heat. The ranch house was a 2-room adobe structure with a covered porch and a detached kitchen and a root cellar and a windmill that creaked in a way that she would eventually come to find comforting. There were outbuildings, a barn, a chicken coop that had seen better days, and about 300 acres of cattle land beyond. Homer Reed ran the ranch alone, which explained the state of the house. Eva stood in the doorway of the main room and catalogued it with the professional eye of a woman who had spent 4 years keeping someone else's establishment. There was a layer of fine red dust on every horizontal surface. The curtains, where they existed, were sun-bleached to transparency. The cookstove needed blacking, the floor needed scrubbing. The calendar on the wall was still showing March, which meant either he was profoundly disorganized or profoundly sentimental, and she suspected the former. "There's a room off the back," he said from behind her. "Bed, washstand, hook for clothes, it's yours. Thank you. Meals are expected at 6, noon, and 6. I'll be in from the range by midday. Breakfast you can leave in the warming oven if I'm gone before you rise." "Understood." "I don't need conversation," he said, and she heard the warning in it, the careful construction of a boundary. "I need food cooked and laundry done and the house kept clean." "That's what the arrangement is." Eva turned to face him. "I understand the arrangement, Mr. Reed." He nodded once curtly and went back outside. She stood in the dusty room for a moment longer, listening to his boots on the porch steps, and then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By the end of the first week, the house was clean. By the end of the second, she had reorganized the kitchen with a logic that Homer silently acknowledged, by stopping his searching through wrong drawers and simply finding things where they should be. She had mended the chicken coop with a combination of spare boards and her own practical stubbornness, which reduced the number of nightly escapes from 6 to 0. She had planted the kitchen garden in straight rows, beans and squash and tomatoes, at his specific instruction, and with a precision that seemed to satisfy some deep need in him for order. He was not a warm man. He was not a cold one either, exactly. He was a man operating at a careful distance from everything, including himself, and Eva, who had spent years being useful to people who did not see her, recognized the particular loneliness of that condition with the practiced eye of someone who had lived adjacent to it. She did not push. She was patient in the way that people who have had no choice develop patience, not as a virtue but as a survival skill that had eventually become a genuine character trait. She cooked well. She kept the house clean. She stayed out of his way when he needed space, which was most of the time, and she was present and steady when he appeared in the kitchen at odd hours, which happened more than she had expected. He would come in at odd angles, not always at meal times. sometimes at 10 in the morning with a look on his face that meant something on the range had gone wrong, and he needed a cup of coffee and 3 minutes of not being alone without anyone asking him to explain himself. She would pour the coffee and set it on the table and go back to her work, and gradually, like a dog approaching something unfamiliar, he would relax his shoulders and drink the coffee and occasionally say something. Not much. Short sentences. Functional observations. The north pasture fence was down. The price of beef had dropped at the Abilene market. The Mendoza brothers who ran the neighboring spread were good neighbors, quiet, decent men who had been in Redrock longer than anyone white could claim. She listened. She responded when a response seemed invited. She did not perform interest. She was genuinely interested because Homer Reed, however deliberately opaque, was an interesting man, and the life he had built in this Red Rock Basin was the kind of life that asked real questions of a person. The hidden part of it came in pieces. She found the first piece in the third week, when she was cleaning the smaller room that functioned as a combined study and storage space. There was a trunk in the corner that she moved to sweep behind it, and when the lid shifted, she saw papers. Not just papers, legal documents, a deed, a letter from a bank in Abilene with the words "outstanding balance" repeated several times in the formal, pitiless language of financial institutions. She closed the lid carefully and swept around it and did not mention what she had seen. But she understood now that the ranch, beautiful and functional as it appeared, was sitting on a financial edge. The harvest season mattered not as a calendar marker, but as the actual mechanism by which Homer Reed intended to save his land. A good cattle price in the fall, a successful harvest of the hay he had been cutting and storing all summer, and the balance would tip in his favor. A bad season, a broken fence, a drought, a sick herd, and it would not. This was why he needed someone through the season, not as a luxury but as a necessity. A housekeeper freed him to work the range from dawn to dark without coming home to an empty, cold house and a cold stove, and the cumulative exhaustion of trying to be in two places at once. She was, she understood, a working component of his survival plan. She filed this information away and kept cooking and cleaning and did not let on that she had begun to understand the shape of his hidden crisis. What she had not accounted for was July. July in Redrock was a specific kind of assault on the senses. The heat came up from the ground as much as down from the sky, and the air had a red-tinged quality that meant dust was in everything: hair, food, the pages of books, the creases of skin at wrist and elbow. It made people simultaneously irritable and lethargic, a difficult combination. On a Thursday evening in mid-July, Eva was sitting on the porch after dinner, doing the mending by the last light before she would need to bring out the lamp, when Homer came out and stood at the porch railing without speaking. He had been working since before sunrise, she knew. The cattle had been moved to the summer pasture that day, a long, dusty, difficult job even for a man with a full crew, and Homer Reed ran his ranch with a single hired hand named Cal Birch, who was 19 years old and enthusiastic in ways that did not always translate to efficiency. Homer stood at the railing and looked at the horizon and said nothing for a long time. Eva kept her eyes on her mending. "You ever been anywhere else?" he said finally. Before Galveston, she looked up. It was the first personal question he had asked her. "I grew up in Georgia," she said. "Moved to Galveston when I was 19. Georgia," he seemed to be filing this away. "Long way." "Yes." Another long pause. The windmill creaked. A coyote made its exploratory sound somewhere out in the dark, probing the distance. "What made you answer the advertisement?" he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not casual, carefully casual, which was different. Eva set down her mending. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was insufficient. "I needed work," she said, and the idea of somewhere new seemed preferable to the idea of somewhere familiar that had stopped working. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the feeling he was processing this against his own experience. "That's an honest answer," he said. "I tend toward honesty when I can manage it." Another silence, but a different kind. The companionable kind, which was a discovery. Cal is not going to be enough help come August, he said, shifting back to practical ground the way he always shifted back to practical ground when a conversation started to feel too revealing. I may need to hire another hand for the cutting. The Mendoza brothers mentioned their cousin was looking for seasonal work, Eva said. I spoke with Maria Mendoza at the church social last Sunday. He turned to look at her then, actually turned, which was not something he did casually. You spoke with the Mendozas. She came to ask if I might have any laying hens to spare. I said I would ask you. She also mentioned her cousin. Something moved across his face that was very close to gratitude but had not quite located that name for itself. I'll ride over tomorrow, he said. I told her you would, Eva said, and went back to her mending. He stayed at the railing for a few more minutes. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly, but feeling the warmth and the light with a peripheral consciousness that is entirely involuntary. Then he said good night and went inside. She sat on the porch for another 10 minutes after that, listening to the coyote and the windmill and the enormous, breathing dark of the Texas summer night, and recognized with a clarity that was almost inconvenient that she was in serious trouble. The trouble deepened through August with the methodical inevitability of a tide coming in. It was not dramatic. That was the insidious thing about it. There were no declarations, no confrontations, no obvious moments of forbidden electricity. It was subtler than that. It lived in small things, in the fact that he started bringing her water from the well in the afternoons without being asked, in the fact that when Cal Birch told a story at dinner that made Eva laugh, Homer watched her laughing with an expression she had learned to read as involuntary pleasure. In the fact that he had begun, unconsciously, to narrate his days to her, not in long, intimate speeches but in short, factual updates that nonetheless assumed her continuous interest in his world. She was aware of the trap in this. The trap was not malicious. It was structural. A woman living in a man's house, cooking his food, tending his things, sharing his porch at evening, will begin to feel the shape of that man's life around her like a second skin. And if the man has any depth to him at all, which Homer Reed certainly did, the feeling will become something more than structural. She was also aware, with the unsentimental clarity that had always been her best defense against the world, that she had no real standing here. She was a hired housekeeper. The arrangement had a stated end date. He had told her this at the outset, and she had told herself she could renegotiate seasons, and she still believed that. But believing was not the same as knowing, and she was honest enough with herself to feel the difference. The hired man's cousin, whose name was Daniel Torres, arrived in the first week of August and turned out to be quiet and hardworking and 22 years old, with a seriousness about his labor that Homer visibly respected. He stayed in the bunkhouse with Cal, and the three men worked the hay cutting through the burning August days, and Eva managed the house and the cooking for 5 people, because feeding 5 people 3 times a day in that heat was itself a form of physical labor that could not be overstated. She did not complain. She found her rhythm and she worked it, and in the evenings when the work was done she sat on the porch with her mending or her book and let herself be present in the particular beauty of a Texas summer night, which was real beauty, fierce and uncompromising and shot through with stars. Sometimes Homer sat with her, not always, often enough. They talked about things. Real things. He told her once, briefly, about the man he had bought the ranch from, an older rancher named Prescott who had run the land for 20 years and died without a will, and whose estate had taken 2 years to settle, and during which time the ranch had deteriorated badly. Homer had bought it in 1878 at a price that seemed fair, until he discovered the full extent of the repairs and the outstanding debt that had attached itself to the property through a tangle of local banking relationships that he was still working to unwind. The bank in Abilene wants to see 4 consecutive seasons of profitable operations before they'll renegotiate the terms, he said. This autumn will be the 4th. Eva absorbed this. So this autumn matters more than the others. Yes, simple, direct. She understood now why the ranch felt like a held breath, why he moved through his days with that particular compressed quality of a man who cannot afford to be wrong about anything. "You'll make it," she said without ornamentation. He looked at her sideways. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But you've survived 3 seasons worse than this one. The herd is healthy. The hay yield is good. Daniel Torres works as hard as 2 men, and Cal Birch, for all his enthusiasms, has gotten better." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest he generally came to smiling. "You've been paying attention." "I pay attention to things that matter," she said. The silence that followed had a quality that neither of them acknowledged but that both of them felt, a recognition moving between them like a current through still water. He looked away first, but he kept sitting there until the stars were full out, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most intimate hour Eva could remember in years. September arrived with the urgency of a season that knows its own brevity. The hay cutting was finished, and the crop was good. The cattle went to the Abilene market in the 3rd week of September, and the prices came back strong, stronger than Homer had estimated, which Eva saw in the way he sat at the kitchen table the evening the wire came from the buyer, not celebrating, not demonstrating any visible emotion, but with a stillness in him that was the stillness of a man who had been braced for impact and found solid ground instead. "Good news," she said, setting his supper plate in front of him. "Better than expected," he said. She waited. "It'll cover the Abilene note," he said, "with something left over." "That's very good," she said. "Yes." He looked at his plate. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, not the careful blankness he used as armor, not the brief involuntary warmth she had learned to watch for, but something more direct, more vulnerable, more frightened. "It means the arrangement is concluded," he said. "The season is essentially over." Eva stood very still. "The original terms," he said, and now he was looking at the plate again, "were through the harvest season, which is concluded." She understood with the precision of a woman who had been waiting for this, who had known it was coming even while hoping that what had grown between them would make it unnecessary, that he was doing the thing she had feared. Not cruelty. Worse than cruelty. Fear in the costume of practicality. She said nothing that evening. She served supper and cleared the table and did the dishes and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought with great care about what she was going to do. She was not going to leave quietly. She had decided that before she finished sitting down. She was not going to pretend that the past 4 months had been the uncomplicated transaction he was now trying to make them. She was not going to allow him, for his own sake as much as hers, to retreat behind the wall he had built before she arrived and pull up the ladder behind him and spend the rest of his carefully managed, beautifully lonely life on the other side of it. She was going to tell him the truth. All of it. But she was going to do it in her own time, in her own way, and she was going to wait for the right moment, which was not the same as waiting indefinitely. The right moment came the next morning. She had slept badly and risen early and made coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table with the letter from the Calder County Employment Gazette in front of her when he came in from his morning chores. He stopped when he saw her sitting there. He saw the letter, and she looked up at him and said, "Sit down, Homer, and tell me the truth this time." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. The morning light came in behind him and made him look exactly like what he was, a man standing at a threshold, inside and outside at the same time, not yet committed to either direction. Then he came in. He sat down. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup she had ready for him, and he was quiet for a long time. "I put temporary in the advertisement," he said finally. "I know, I read it as a negotiating position." The corner of his mouth moved again. "You would." "What happened to the woman before me?" Eva said. He went still. "There was one," she said, not accusing, factual. "I found a woman's handkerchief in the back of the linen closet when I reorganized it in June. The embroidery was fine work, not something a ranch woman makes for herself, something that was given as a gift. I put it in the trunk in the study." He looked at the table. "You don't have to tell me all of it," she said. "I think you should tell me enough." The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. Then he said, "Her name was Clara Howell. She came in the spring of 1880 from Dallas. She was a widow, children grown. She said she wanted a new start." A pause. "She stayed 8 months. What happened?" "She decided she wanted a different kind of life. She went back east." Another pause. "To a man she had apparently been corresponding with the whole time she was here. A man in Philadelphia." His voice was quiet and even and gave very little away. But Eva, who had learned to hear what was underneath his voice as well as in it, heard the thing he was not saying. "You had begun to care for her," Eva said. He said nothing. "And when she left, you told yourself that it was because you had made the mistake of allowing permanence where you had only contracted for temporary. And so you went back to contracting for temporary because you thought it was safer." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were the gray-green of the river in winter, deep and cold and utterly present. "That is a very accurate assessment," he said, with a dryness that did not quite conceal how exposed he felt. "Homer," she leaned forward slightly, "this is not the same. I am not Clara Howell, and you know it. I know you are not Clara Howell. Then what are you afraid of?" The question landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in deep water, sending rings outward in every direction. He stood up. He went to the window and stood looking out at the morning yard, at the barn and the windmill and the red rock ridges in the distance, at the world he had built and almost lost and was slowly, season by painful season, reclaiming. "I am afraid," he said, very quietly, "that you are the kind of woman who changes everything. And I have spent 4 years trying to build a life here that I can manage, that I can control. That is not going to be taken from me." He paused. "I have been here before, not with a woman, with the land, with the bank. With everything you build out here and watch fail anyway." He turned to look at her. "You scare me more than any of it." Eva held his gaze. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I came here on a stagecoach from Galveston with 42 cents and a broken carpetbag," she said. "I have been making something out of nothing my entire adult life. I am not a woman who fails. I am not a woman who leaves when things become difficult." She stood up from the table. "And I am deeply, furiously in love with you, Homer Reed, which is an inconvenience I have been managing for approximately 2 months, and I am done managing it quietly." He stared at her. She stared back. "Now," she said, "you can tell me to pack my things and put me on the next stagecoach back to nowhere in particular, and you can spend the rest of your life alone on this beautiful piece of land that you have worked your fingers to the bone for. Or you can stop being afraid long enough to realize that what is standing in front of you is not a threat. It is the best thing that has ever happened to you." The kitchen was very quiet. The windmill creaked. A chicken made an exploratory sound from the direction of the coop. Homer Reed crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the careful, provisional gesture of a man who was still deciding. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding back for months and had finally released the mechanism, both hands cupping her face, his forehead coming down to rest against hers afterward with the weight of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and he sounded younger than she had ever heard him. "Neither do I," she said, "but I am a quick learner." He laughed then, an actual laugh, brief and startled and completely unguarded, and she filed it away as one of the most precious things she had ever heard. "Stay," he said, "not for the season. Just stay." "Yes," she said. The weeks that followed had the quality of something unfurling. Not a dramatic transformation, because Homer Reed was constitutionally incapable of dramatic transformation, but a gradual, steady opening like the desert after rain, when things bloom that you did not know were waiting. He was cautious still. She was patient still. But the nature of the caution and the patience had changed, because now they were both moving towards something rather than managing a careful distance. He told her things. Not all at once, not in great confessional floods, but in the piece-by-piece way of a private man learning to trust. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the second of 3 sons of a farmer who worked the land with a stubborn devotion that had not ultimately saved him from failure. He told her about the years in his 20s when he had worked cattle drives, the Kishom Trail and others, moving north with great herds of longhorns through heat and storm, and the constant specific danger of that work. He told her about the accident on the Cimarron River in 1876 that had killed his closest friend, a man named Webb, and from which he himself had barely emerged, and how he had taken the insurance money from his friend's estate, left to him as Webb had no family, and used it as the down payment on the Redrock land because he could not go back to a life that was entirely motion with no fixed point. Webb would have liked it here, he said once, looking out over the land at dusk. "Tell me about him," Eva said, and he did. And she listened the way she always listened, with her full self, and when he was done, there was a silence between them that was warm rather than empty, the silence of someone being truly heard. She told him things, too, about Georgia and the war years and the particular devastation of growing up in a landscape that had been broken and was slowly trying to remember what it was. About her mother, who had been a seamstress and a reader, who had given Eva both skills and died of fever when Eva was 16, leaving her to manage the household and then eventually to leave it. About the years in Galveston in Mrs. Marsh's shop, where she had been useful and invisible in equal measure, and how the invisible part had eventually become more real than the useful part, until she had felt herself disappearing piece by piece into the daily routine of other people's clothes and other people's needs. "You came here to become visible again," he said. She looked at him with surprise because it was the most perceptive thing he had ever said to her. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." He reached across the porch railing and covered her hand with his and left his hand there. She turned hers over and held on. In November, when the weather had cooled to something almost gentle, and the Red Rock country had taken on its autumn colors of rust and amber, and the deep gold of the dried grasses, Homer rode into Redrock and came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper that he set on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony. Inside the package was a ring, not fancy. A thin gold band with a small setting of garnets, dark red stones that caught the afternoon light in a way that reminded her of the landscape they were living in. "I am not a man who is good at speeches," he said, standing across the table from her with his hat in his hands and an expression that was the bravest thing she had ever seen on a human face because it was entirely unguarded. "I am not a man who is naturally comfortable with this kind of thing, but I know what I want, and I know what this land needs, and I know what I need, and those are all the same thing, and it is you. It has been you since July, at minimum. Possibly since the first evening on the porch." Eva looked at the ring, then she looked at him. "The first evening on the porch," she said, "was when you asked me where I came from. You had been working up to asking me something personal for 3 weeks. I had," he admitted. "You also pretended it was a casual question." "I did. It was not a casual question." "No," he said, "it was not." She picked up the ring. It fit her left hand as if it had been made for it, which it had, because he had traced the circumference of her finger on a piece of paper while she slept in her chair one evening on the porch. She had found the paper later and said nothing about it, storing it away with the other evidences of his secret and furious caring. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He came around the table and she stood up and he put his arms around her, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen of the house she had cleaned and reorganized and made smell like bread and soap and something livable, and she felt him exhale fully for what she suspected was the first time in years. They were married on the first Saturday of December 1882 in the small church in Redrock by the minister Reverend Caleb Fowler, with Cal Birch and Daniel Torres as witnesses and Maria Mendoza and her husband as the only guests, because Homer had no family he was in contact with and Eva had no family within 1,000 miles, and they had decided that small and real was preferable to large and performed. Maria cried, because Maria was that kind of person and was delighted about it. Cal Birch knocked over one of the church's 2 candle stands, which was in character. Daniel Torres stood quietly and watched the proceedings with the composed, approving expression of a man who had worked alongside Homer Reed for 3 months and was glad to see him in possession of something good. Eva wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool she had made herself in Galveston, altered to fit the woman she had become since then, which was the same woman but more present in herself. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Maria had brought, tied with a piece of ribbon, and she stood in front of Reverend Fowler and Homer Reed and said her vows in a clear voice that did not waver, because she had spent enough of her life uncertain, and she was done with that particular flavor of fear. Homer said his vows with the same quality of absolute sincerity he brought to everything, looking at her face, not at Reverend Fowler, not at his hat, not at the floor, but at her face, which she understood as the deepest form of courage for a man who had spent years looking away. Then they drove back to the ranch in the wagon in the December afternoon, the sky overhead the clean deep blue of a cold, clear day, the red rock ridges casting long shadows across the basin, and Homer held the reins with one hand and held her hand with the other, and Eva Hale, who was now Eva Reed, looked at the land around her and felt something she could only describe as a rival. The first winter as a married couple was the season in which Eva learned the full depth of what she had taken on and found, to her complete satisfaction, that she was equal to it. Homer Reed was not an easy man to be married to in certain technical respects. He was private in ways that sometimes felt like distance. He was slow to articulate emotional states, not because he did not feel them, but because he had spent years considering emotions as either dangerous or irrelevant, and rewiring that response was a gradual process. He woke at 4:30 in the morning because decades of ranch life had made it automatic, and he was not quiet about the early morning preparations, and Eva, who was not naturally an early riser, adapted because adaptation was a skill she had honed to a fine edge. But in the ways that mattered most, he was extraordinary. He was honest. Completely, sometimes uncomfortably honest, which she had to recalibrate her preference for occasionally, because there was such a thing as too much candor about whether the biscuits had come out right. But the honesty was real and it was consistent, and in a world where she had spent years working for people who smiled at her and meant none of it, his particular brand of blunt sincerity was something she valued beyond almost anything. He was steady. In the way of someone who has been tested repeatedly and come back to himself repeatedly, who knows the shape of his own character through experience rather than theory. When things went wrong, which they did, because this was ranching in 1883 in West Texas, and things went wrong as a matter of course, he met them with the same quality of focused competence he brought to everything, and she found this steadiness more comforting than any amount of reassurance. And he was, in the private hours they shared, the person she had suspected him of being from the beginning of the third week, when the careful performance of indifference had started to develop the small cracks through which his actual self had leaked. He was curious about the world and about her specifically, asking questions about her thoughts on things with a genuine interest that made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like someone whose inner landscape was worth exploring. He was funny in the driest possible way, a humor so quiet that it was easy to miss but devastating once you tuned to its frequency. He remembered everything she told him, every small thing. He would bring them up weeks later in contexts that proved he had been thinking about them in the interval. She loved him more each month, which was both wonderful and somewhat alarming in its intensity. In the spring of 1883, the bank in Abilene reviewed the four-season record and sent a letter that Homer read at the kitchen table 3 times before handing it to Eva without comment. The letter offered to renegotiate the loan terms at a substantially reduced interest rate, citing the consistent repayment history and the improved status of the property as assessed by the bank's regional representative. 4 seasons, Eva said. 4 seasons, he confirmed. She looked at the letter. This is what you have been working toward for 4 years. Yes. How does it feel? He was quiet for a moment. Like something being put down, he said finally. Something I've been carrying so long I forgot it was there. She put the letter on the table and went to him, and he pulled her close, and she felt him breathe. They replanted the kitchen garden that spring with the same straight rows, but more of them. Eva had ideas about expanding the vegetable production, selling the surplus to the general store in Redrock, and to the railroad cookhouse that was established that year when the Texas and Pacific Railroad extended its line through the basin. Homer listened to her ideas with the focused attention he gave to anything practical and agreed they were worth trying. And by the end of the summer of 1883, the kitchen garden had become something more than a kitchen garden. It was a small but functioning enterprise that brought in supplemental income with a regularity that Homer, raised to see ranching as the only viable activity, found somewhat astonishing. "You built a business," he said, looking at her books one evening, the neat columns of income from the store and the cookhouse. "I organized a resource," she said. "That is what a business is." She smiled at him over the table. "You're pleased with yourself," he observed. "Moderately," she said. "I'm trying not to be immodest." "Please be immodest," he said. "It's well earned." She laughed, and he watched her with that expression she had been watching him try to contain since July of the previous year, the involuntary softening, the unguarded happiness, and he had gotten better at not containing it, which she considered one of the most significant achievements of the past year. Cal Birch, who had stayed on permanently, revealed in the fall of 1883 that he had been quietly courting one of the Fowler daughters, the minister's younger daughter Ruth, a quiet and capable young woman of 19 who had grown up with the specific resilience of a frontier minister's child. Homer gave Cal a raise that was functionally a wedding present, and Eva made Ruth a quilt from the fabric scraps she had been saving since June, a complex pattern of reds and blues that she finished 3 nights running by lamplight. Daniel Torres had gone back to his family's spread after the first harvest season, but rode over twice a month with easy regularity, accepted Sunday dinner as a matter of course, and had become the closest thing to a family friend that either of them had. In the winter of 1883, Eva told Homer she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast, because she was a practical woman and did not see the advantage in manufacturing dramatic settings for practical information. She set his coffee in front of him and sat down and said, "I am expecting a child. By my calculation, the baby will arrive in June or July." He looked at her across the table. His face did the thing it did when something reached him at a deeper level than his control mechanisms could manage, that layered, undefended expression that she had learned to read as the true state of Homer Reed beneath all the careful management. He got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he held them for a long time without saying anything. "Homer," she said gently, "say something." "I am trying to find the right words," he said, and his voice was rough in the way it got when he was feeling something large. "Any words," she said. "I'm not grading them." He looked up at her. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said. "That is all I have." "That is quite enough," she said, and leaned down and pressed her forehead to his. The pregnancy was not easy in the physical sense. The Texas summer heat was what it always was, and being large with child in July in a West Texas basin was not a condition that lent itself to comfort. Eva managed it with the same practical stubbornness she brought to every difficulty, modifying her activities as needed, accepting help from Maria Mendoza, who had 3 children of her own and was an encyclopedia of practical obstetric knowledge, and from Ruth Birch, who was newly married and delighted to be useful. Homer was, in ways she had not quite predicted, remarkable during the pregnancy. He was not the hovering, anxious type, which she appreciated because she would have found hovering maddening, but he had rearranged the household in small, unannounced ways that she noticed one by one. The water bucket had been moved to a lower shelf. The heavier kitchen tasks had quietly redistributed themselves to his own chore list. He had, without consulting her, purchased a rocking chair from the furniture maker in Redrock and set it on the shaded end of the porch with the air of a man who considers the matter closed. She loved him so fiercely sometimes that she found it difficult to be in the same room without showing it, which he had admitted once, quietly, that he felt the same way about. Their son was born on the 8th of July, 1884, delivered by Maria Mendoza with steady hands and a complete absence of drama. He was a healthy boy, 8 pounds, with dark hair like his father and Eva's particular quality of absolute attention in his eyes. They named him James Webb Reed, the second name for Homer's friend, the one who had died on the Cimarron, whose insurance money had bought this land, whose ghost lived here in a benign and grateful way. Homer held his son for the first time with the same quality of carefully controlled feeling that characterized his strongest emotions, the stillness that was not emptiness but its opposite, a fullness so complete it required all his control to contain. He looked at this small person who was entirely new and somehow entirely known, and Eva, watching from the bed, saw on his face the final dissolution of the last wall. It was not a dramatic dissolution. It was the quiet kind, the way ice yields in early spring, not cracking but simply becoming water and running in a new direction. "Hello," Homer said to his son, in the voice he used when he was speaking to something that mattered more than he knew how to say. "I'm glad you made it here." James Webb Reed looked at his father with the profound, unfocused attention of the newly born. Homer looked at Eva over the baby's head. "Thank you," he said, and she understood that the thank you was not only for the child, not only for the labor and the difficulty of the birth, but for everything, for coming, for staying, for outlasting the season and the wall and the long, careful silence of a man who had been afraid for years. "Thank you," she said back, and meant it the same way. The years that followed built on each other with the satisfying logic of something constructed from true materials. The ranch became profitable in the genuine sense in the mid-1880s, when Homer expanded the herd and began selling directly to the railroad rather than through the Abilene middlemen. The vegetable enterprise that Eva had built continued to grow, and by 1886 she was supplying 3 establishments in Redrock and had begun, quietly and practically, to employ 2 women from town to help with the increased production, which she managed with the same organized intelligence she had brought to Mrs. Marsh's dress shop, but now in service of something entirely her own. James grew into a boy who was his father in miniature around the eyes and his mother everywhere else, which Eva found deeply satisfying. He was a serious child, not grim, but focused, with a quality of watchful intelligence that earned him the respect of even the gruffest ranch hands before he was 5 years old. He could ride before he was 4 because Homer, who had strong opinions about practical skills, began teaching him early, and he took to it with the naturalness of a child who has grown up hearing horses and understanding their logic before he understood his own. In the summer of 1886, Eva found herself pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier because she knew the territory. Their second child was a girl. She arrived in January of 1887, a winter baby, born in the warmth of the ranch house while a blue norther howled outside and dropped the temperature to something that required the big fireplace burning through the night. She was smaller than James had been at birth, but equally healthy, and equipped from her first hours with a voice that established her intentions clearly. They named her Margaret Clara Reed, the second name a deliberate and considered reclamation, because Eva had decided that Clara Howell's name should not carry only the weight of Homer's old wound, but should be reattached to something entirely good. Homer looked at his daughter with the expression of a man encountering a kind of love he had not previously known existed, which was different again from the love he felt for James, and from the love he felt for Eva, its own country entirely, with its own terrain. "She looks at me like she's deciding something," he said. She definitely is, Eva said. What is she deciding? Whether you're worthy, Eva said and watched him smile. Cal Birch and Ruth had their first child in 1885, a boy they named Thomas, and their household and the Reed household became the close neighboring world that children grow up in when they are lucky, a community of front porch visits and shared meals and the easy borrowing of tools and advice that constitutes genuine friendship. Daniel Torres eventually married a woman named Rosa from San Antonio, a schoolteacher of genuine intelligence and wit, and moved his family to Redrock in 1887, and the Torres family became the fourth corner of what Eva had come to think of as their actual world, small and particular and sufficient in the way of things that are built rather than inherited. The injustices of the time were not invisible to them. They lived in West Texas in the 1880s, and the land around them carried the weight of contested histories, the forced removals of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples from the land that was now homesteaded and ranched, the particular pressures on families like the Mendozas and the Torres family, whose names and histories placed them in the complicated position of being simultaneously native to this land in a deep sense and legally precarious within the systems that now governed it. Eva had grown up in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War and knew firsthand the cost of systems that treated people's lives as negotiable, and she brought to her dealings with everyone she encountered a quality of directness and respect that was not common in Redrock, but was not unnoticed. Homer, who was by nature a man of fairness if not always of articulated principle, followed her lead in this more than he led, which he acknowledged with a quietness that was its own form of honesty. When the local school needed a board member who would support the teaching of children regardless of their background, Eva went to the meeting. When the question of water rights came before the county, and the Torres family's claim was being contested by a larger Anglo landowner, Homer testified on their behalf with the same blunt, factual honesty he brought to everything, and his standing in Redrock as an established rancher carried weight. They could not fix everything. They were two people in a county in a time that had its own enormous gravitational forces. But they moved through their world with their eyes open and their integrity intact, and they taught James and Margaret to do the same. In the autumn of 1889, James started at the Redrock School, which now had a proper building and a teacher imported from Missouri named Miss Hartwell, who was young and serious and very good. James went on his first day with the solemnity of a child who has understood from the people around him that learning is a serious enterprise worth treating with respect, and came home that afternoon with the mildly overwhelmed expression of someone who has encountered more information than anticipated. "How was it?" Eva asked. "There is a great deal to learn," James said, at 5 years old with the gravity of a senator. "Yes," she agreed, "there always is." Homer, coming in from the barn, heard this exchange and caught Eva's eye over James's head with the private, shared amusement that had become one of the primary currencies of their marriage, the unspoken communication of two people who have learned each other's language deeply enough to have entire conversations without words. Margaret, who was 2.5 and unimpressed by the importance of James's first school day, attempted to eat a piece of chalk from James's new slate, which required intervention. The house was full and warm and sometimes loud and almost always demanding, and Eva Reed stood in the middle of it all with the feeling she had been searching for since she was 19 years old, the feeling of being entirely in the right place, doing the right work, with the right person. She found Homer on the porch that evening after the children were in bed, standing at the railing in the October dark, looking at the stars. She went and stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the companionable way that no longer felt like distance, but like the space he needed to find the true words. "That first September," he said, "when the cattle price came in good, I sat at the table and thought, this is the end of the season, the arrangement is over, she can go." "I remember," Eva said. I thought that was the only logical conclusion. Get through the season, send her back, maintain the plan. He paused, and the whole time I was thinking it, there was something else running underneath it that kept saying I was making a catastrophic error. What stopped you from listening to it? You sat down, he said. You sat down at the table, and you told me to tell you the truth. And I had never had someone say that to me in a way that made telling the truth seem possible. She put her hand over his on the railing. What would you have done if I had just packed my things and left that morning? She asked. Gone to Redrock and brought you back, he said without hesitation. She looked at him. Probably, he amended. Definitely, she said. He turned to face her, and in the starlight his face had the quality it had when he was being entirely honest, open in a way that was still new enough to move her every time she saw it. I want you to know something, he said. Tell me. I have never in my life been as certain of anything as I am of you, he said. I have been uncertain about the land and the money and the cattle and the weather and the future generally. I have not been uncertain about you for a single day since October of 1882. Eva Reed, who was not a woman who cried easily, felt her eyes go warm. That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, she told him. He looked slightly embarrassed. It's just the truth. Homer, she said, the truth from you is the most romantic thing in the world. He leaned down and kissed her in the way she loved best, with intention and without reservation, and she put both hands against his chest and felt the solid steadiness of him. This man who had been afraid and lonely and built himself a life out of pure determination, and who had finally been frightened into something better. The stars hung above Redrock, Texas in the October dark of 1889, thick and brilliant over the red rock ridges, over the scrub and the mesquite and the windmill that still creaked in the same companionable way it had been creaking since that first June evening when Eva Hale had stepped down from a stagecoach with 42 cents and a broken carpetbag, and looked at a man with a dented hat and decided that seasons were negotiable. She had outlasted the season. She had outlasted the wall. She had outlasted the fear and the hidden debt and the dark past of a man who had forgotten how to trust, and she had done it not with force or drama, but with patience and intelligence, and the kind of love that does not announce itself constantly, because it does not need to. In the spring of 1891, Eva found herself expecting a third child, which she announced at the breakfast table in the same practical way she had announced the previous two. Homer received this news with the seasoned warmth of a man who knew now what it meant and what it would bring, both the difficulty and the joy of it, and he smiled at her across the breakfast table, a full smile, not the corner-of-the-mouth gesture she had spent months coaxing out of him in that first season, but a real one, wide and unhurried. June, he guessed. July, I think, she said. James, who was 7 and understood the situation clearly, looked up from his oatmeal with the focused interest of a child who has processed information and arrived at a relevant question. Will it be a boy or a girl? We don't know yet, Eva said. I hope it's a boy, James said. I hope it's a girl, Margaret, who was 4, announced firmly. We will see, Homer said, with the equanimity of a man who had learned that some things were worth letting unfold. The third child arrived in July of 1891, a boy, whom they named Thomas after Cal and Ruth's eldest, and for whom Thomas Birch, now 6, expressed complicated emotions about sharing a name but ultimately accepted with the resilience of frontier children. They named him Thomas Hale Reed, the middle name Eva's, and Homer said it with the air of a man putting something right that he had been meaning to put right for a long time. The Reed household in 1891 was a different world from the silent, dusty ranch house that Eva had stepped into in June of 1882. It was full of the accumulated texture of 9 years of living, of children's voices and the smell of bread, and the sound of the windmill and Homer's boots on the porch boards, and the chickens and the dogs that had appeared over the years and been named and integrated. It was a world that had been built by 2 people who had each arrived at it from a dark place, and had, together, made something that neither could have made alone. Eva sometimes stood in the kitchen in the early morning before anyone else was up, and let herself feel it. let herself feel the full weight of what had been built here, not the financial weight, not the practical weight, but the essential weight of it, the depth and the realness and the permanence that she had believed was possible even when she had no evidence for it. All the way back on a stagecoach from Galveston with 42 cents and a broken clasp, and a determination that had turned out to be exactly sufficient. Homer found her there once, on an early morning in the October of 1891, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the lightening sky, holding her coffee cup with both hands. He came and stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood looking out the window together at the dawn coming up over the Redrock ridges, the sky going from deep purple to the clear burning blue that always came eventually. "What are you thinking?" he asked, and it was the same question she had asked him 2 years ago on the porch under the stars, returned to her in the private economy of their marriage. "That I am exactly where I should be," she said. "That everything is exactly as it should be." He pressed his face into her hair. "Yes," he said. Around them, the house was just beginning to stir. James's feet could be heard on the floor of the room above. Margaret would be awake and constructing some small chaos within the next few minutes. Thomas, 8 months old, was still quiet in his cradle but would not be for long. The windmill creaked. The chickens were beginning their morning commentary. The horses shifted in the barn and made their patient, ordinary sounds. Homer Reed held Eva Reed in the kitchen of the house they had built into a home, and she leaned back into him and held onto his arms, and the day came up around them like a tide, full of light, full of sound, full of the ongoing beautiful difficulty of a life that was entirely and completely theirs. He had said he only needed someone to last the season. She had outlasted everything, and what they had built in the outlasting was not a compromise or a consolation or a second choice. It was the thing itself, the real thing, the irreplaceable and irreducible thing that people spend their whole lives searching for in the red rock canyons and the dust and the vast star-scattered dark of a world that can be brutal and can also sometimes be this. It was home. It was love. It was the straight-road kitchen garden in June, and the creak of the windmill at night, and a man with a dented hat who held her face in his hands with the careful intensity of someone holding something that is not fragile but is infinitely precious. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The seasons kept turning in Redrock, Texas, one after another, and every one of them belonged to Eva and Homer Reed, and every one of them was good.